Murder at the Puppet Show. Welcome to Mindful Musings, dear listeners. I'm William, your narrator, and today I'm sharing a tale of mystery that unfolds through the keen observations of that remarkable lady detective, Miss Jane Marple. Our story begins in the quaint village of Little Wickham, where even the most innocent entertainment can mask deadly secrets. Let me take you there now, as we see events through Miss Marple's perceptive eyes. Chapter 1. The Marionette's Last Dance. The autumn fair had come to Little Wickham, bringing with it the usual assortment of travelling entertainers. Among them was Professor Grimaldi's Puppet Theatre, a peculiar attraction that had drawn quite a crowd that Saturday afternoon. Miss Marple, having promised her great-nephew to attend, found herself seated on a wooden bench alongside dozens of excited children and their parents. Professor Augustus Grimaldi was a striking figure, tall and angular, with silver hair swept back dramatically and fingers that moved with uncanny precision as he manipulated his marionettes. His show that day featured elaborate Victorian puppets in period costume, telling tales that seemed rather dark for a children's performance. "Notice how he lingers on the tragic scenes," Miss Marple murmured to Mrs. Bantry, who had joined her. "Most unusual for a children's entertainer." The performance concluded with thunderous applause, though Miss Marple noticed several adults exchanging uncomfortable glances. As the crowd dispersed, she observed Professor Grimaldi packing his puppets with extraordinary care, each one wrapped in black velvet before being placed in ornate wooden cases. "Magnificent collection," commented Colonel Melrose, who had attended with his grandchildren. "Some of those puppets must be genuine antiques." "Indeed," Grimaldi replied, his accent carrying traces of Italian origin. "Several date back to 1878. They tell stories that most would prefer forgotten." Miss Marple's keen ears detected something pointed in his tone, and she noticed how his gaze lingered on Mrs. Thornfield, the local magistrate's wife, who quickly looked away. Later that evening, as Miss Marple tended her garden, she heard the church bells ringing, not in their usual pattern, but in the urgent cadence that signalled disaster. Young Constable Reed came hurrying down the lane. "There's been a death at the fairground, Miss Marple," he said breathlessly. "The puppet master, found behind his theatre. Inspector Clement asks if you might come." The fairground, so lively hours before, now stood eerily quiet under the gas lamps. Police had cordoned off the puppet theatre, its colourful facade now sinister in the shadows. Inspector Clement, a thoughtful man who had learned to value Miss Marple's insights, led her behind the structure. Professor Grimaldi lay sprawled on the ground, his silver hair dark with blood. But it was the arrangement around him that made Miss Marple's breath catch. His puppets had been positioned in a deliberate tableau. A Victorian gentleman puppet stood over a fallen lady puppet, while a third puppet, dressed as a banker, appeared to be fleeing the scene. "Good heavens," Miss Marple whispered. "The Hartley Square murder of 1878. Inspector Clement looked puzzled. "You recognize this arrangement?" "It's quite famous among those who study Victorian crime," she explained. "James Hartley, a respected banker, murdered his wife's lover and attempted to frame his business partner. The case was never properly solved, though Hartley was suspected. He fled to Italy and was never seen again." "And someone has recreated it here with puppets?" Miss Marple examined the scene more carefully, noting how precisely each puppet was positioned. "Not just someone, Inspector. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't merely a theatrical arrangement, it's an accusation." The inspector crouched beside Grimaldi's body. The medical examiner estimates death occurred around 6 o'clock, shortly after the last show. Blunt force trauma to the head. Was anything taken? Miss Marple inquired. His money box is intact, and the puppets, despite being valuable, are all here. Though, the inspector pointed to an empty puppet case. One seems to be missing. Miss Marple studied the case's velvet lining, noting its unusual size and shape. How very curious. And tell me, has anyone shown particular interest in Professor Grimaldi since his arrival? Several people, actually. He'd been making quite a stir, claiming he had stories to tell that would shake the foundations of respectable society. As they spoke, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught sight of something glinting in the grass, a small silver button bearing an unusual crest. She discreetly pointed it out to the inspector, who carefully collected it as evidence. The puzzle was beginning to form in Miss Marple's mind, though many pieces remained missing. Chapter 2. Shadows from the Past. The next morning brought unseasonable fog to Little Wickham, shrouding the village in grey mist. Miss Marple sat in her parlour consulting old newspaper clippings she'd requested from the library. The Hartley Square murder had indeed been sensational, the stuff of penny dreadfuls and cautionary tales. A knock at her door interrupted her research. Mrs. Thornfield stood on the doorstep, her usual composure clearly shaken. "Miss Marple, might I speak with you privately?" Once seated with tea, Mrs. Thornfield twisted her hands nervously. "You've always been discreet, and I need advice. That puppet man, Professor Grimaldi, he approached me last week with the most extraordinary claim." Miss Marple waited patiently as the woman gathered her courage. "He said he had letters, old letters, that proved my great-grandfather, Silas Thornfield, was connected to the Hartley Square murder. Not as a criminal, you understand, but as someone who helped James Hartley escape to Italy." "Did he show you these letters?" "Only one. Enough to convince me they were genuine. My great-grandfather's handwriting is quite distinctive. I have many of his papers. Grimaldi wanted money for his silence, claiming the scandal would ruin our family's reputation, perhaps even affect my husband's position." Miss Marple set down her teacup thoughtfully. "Did you pay him?" "I was going to. We arranged to meet after yesterday's performance, but when I arrived I found that horrible scene." "What time did you arrive?" 6:15. I saw the puppets arranged like that and fled immediately. I couldn't bear to be associated with such horror." After Mrs. Thornfield departed, Miss Marple received another visitor, Dr. Marcus Webb, the village physician, who'd recently returned from examining Grimaldi's body. "Most unusual case," he said, accepting tea gratefully. "The blow that killed him was precise, delivered with considerable knowledge of anatomy. Also, there were old scars on his hands and arms, consistent with someone who'd worked with sharp tools for many years." "Puppet strings can cut deeply when pulled too quickly," Miss Marple observed. "Tell me, did you notice anything about his clothing?" "Now that you mention it, yes. A button was missing from his waistcoat, a rather expensive one, I'd say, from the quality of the remaining ones." Miss Marple produced the button she'd found at the scene. "Like this?" Dr. Webb examined it closely. "No, different entirely. This bears the Melrose family crest." That afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Colonel Melrose at his estate. She found him in his study, surrounded by military memorabilia and family portraits. "Dreadful business about the puppet fellow," he said gruffly. "Though I can't say I'm entirely surprised. Man was clearly up to no good, making threats and insinuations." "He threatened you?" The colonel's face reddened. not exactly threatened, but he made comments about military honours and how some were earned through less than honourable means, seemed to be implying something about my grandfather's Victoria Cross. Your grandfather served in India, didn't he? Around 1878? Yes, returned home that year, actually, just before the Hartley Square incident. The Colonel paused, realization dawning. You don't think... I think Professor Grimaldi had a talent for uncovering old secrets, Miss Marple said carefully. The question is, which secret led to his death? She noticed a photograph on the Colonel's desk, a recent Fair Committee meeting. Several familiar faces were present, including Mrs. Thornfield, the Colonel himself, and surprisingly, young Timothy Hartley, descendant of the infamous James Hartley, who'd recently returned from abroad to claim an inheritance. When was this taken? 2 weeks ago. Young Hartley's trying to rehabilitate the family name, involved himself in local affairs. Decent chap, actually, despite his ancestry. Miss Marple studied the photograph intently. In the background, partially obscured, stood a figure that looked remarkably like Professor Grimaldi, though without his theatrical silver hair. The mystery was deepening, and Miss Marple sensed that the puppet master's death was merely the final act in a drama that had been unfolding for weeks, perhaps even months. Chapter 3. Letters and Lies. Inspector Clement had established headquarters in the village hall, where evidence from Grimaldi's wagon was being catalogued. Miss Marple arrived to find him examining an ornate wooden box filled with correspondence. These letters are extraordinary, he said, showing her a yellowed envelope. They detail a conspiracy involving several prominent Victorian families, all connected to helping James Hartley escape justice. Miss Marple read carefully, noting dates and signatures. These are damaging indeed. The Thornfields, the Melroses, even the Weymouth family, all implicated in aiding a murderer. But here's what's puzzling, the inspector continued. We've found letters to all these families, but several are missing from the sequence. Numbers 3, 7, and 11 of what appears to be a 15-letter series. Perhaps our killer took them. That's my thought. But why those specific letters? Young Timothy Hartley entered, having been summoned for questioning. He was a pleasant-faced man of 30 with earnest eyes and ink-stained fingers suggesting scholarly pursuits. Inspector, I came as soon as I received your message. How can I help? Mr. Hartley, what was your relationship with Professor Grimaldi? Timothy's expression darkened. He was attempting to destroy what little reputation my family has left. He claimed to have proof that my ancestor not only committed murder, but corrupted half the village to aid his escape. Did he approach you directly? Last Tuesday. He wanted me to pay him to suppress the letters. When I refused, he threatened to perform a special show. A puppet recreation of the Hartley Square murder with all the sordid details. Miss Marple interjected gently. Where were you yesterday evening? At the vicarage, discussing arrangements for my grandmother's memorial service. The vicar can confirm I was there until 6:30. After Timothy left, Miss Marple examined the puppet collection more closely. Each puppet was a masterwork, with faces carved in amazing detail. One caught her attention, a female puppet in Victorian dress, whose face seemed hauntingly familiar. Inspector, this puppet resembles someone, though I can't quite place who. Dr. Webb arrived with his final autopsy report. The weapon was likely a puppet control bar, those wooden crosses that control the strings. I found microscopic paint flakes in the wound matching the theatre's equipment. So the killer used Grimaldi's own tools against him, the inspector mused. There's more, Dr. Webb continued. Grimaldi had stage makeup on, heavy foundation and powder. He'd drastically altered his appearance for performances. Miss Marple suddenly remembered something. Doctor, you mentioned Grimaldi had old scars. Were any recent? One was quite fresh, a deep cut on his left palm, perhaps a week old. That evening, Miss Marple attended evensong, where she noticed several significant absences. Mrs. Thornfield was there but seemed distracted, constantly checking her watch. Colonel Melrose sat rigidly in his family pew while Timothy Hartley knelt in prolonged prayer. After the service, she encountered Miss Weymouth, the elderly postmistress, who had been sorting through the day's mail. Such drama, Miss Weymouth whispered. Did you know that puppet man received registered letters from Italy? 3 in the past month, all from the same law firm. How interesting. Do you recall the firm's name? Benedetti and Associates from Rome. I remember because it's the same firm that handled young Mr. Hartley's inheritance papers. Miss Marple filed this information away, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The connection between Grimaldi and the Hartley family was stronger than anyone had suspected. Walking home through the foggy streets, she noticed a figure lurking near the fairground. Moving closer, she recognized Mrs. Thornfield's housemaid Sarah, apparently searching for something among the grass where the puppet theatre had stood. Lost something, my dear? Sarah startled, dropping a small electric torch. Oh, Miss Marple, Mrs. Thornfield lost an earring yesterday. Thought I might find it. But Miss Marple had glimpsed what Sarah had been holding. Not an earring, but a small brass key, the type that might open an antique letterbox or document case. Chapter 4. The Missing Marionette. The following morning brought news that sent ripples through Little Wickham. The missing puppet had been found, discovered in the old mill pond by children catching tadpoles. But this was no ordinary puppet. It was dressed as a Victorian police constable, and pinned to its chest was a note, "Justice delayed is not justice denied." Inspector Clement had the puppet brought to the village hall, where Miss Marple examined it carefully. The craftsmanship was different from Grimaldi's other pieces, older, with ivory joints instead of wood. This puppet predates the others by decades, she observed. See the style of carving? This is genuine 1870s work. Mrs. Bantry arrived, breathless with gossip. The whole village is talking. They say this puppet belonged to the original investigator of the Hartley Square murder, Inspector Thomas Blackwood. Blackwood, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Now, why does that name sound familiar? Oh, you must remember, Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. His granddaughter lives in the next village, Mary Blackwood. She's that reclusive artist who specializes in restoration work. The inspector's eyes sharpened. We should speak with her immediately. They found Mary Blackwood in her workshop, surrounded by antique toys and automata in various stages of repair. She was a woman of 60, with silver-streaked hair and artist's hands marked by years of detailed work. I wondered when you'd come, she said calmly, setting down her tools. I heard about the puppet. You knew Professor Grimaldi? The inspector asked. Knew him? He was my cousin, though he went by Augustus Grimaldi instead of his real name, Albert Blackwood. We were both descendants of Inspector Thomas Blackwood. Miss Marple leaned forward. Your grandfather investigated the original Hartley Square murder and was ruined by it, Mary said bitterly. He knew James Hartley was guilty but couldn't prove it. When Hartley escaped, Grandfather was blamed for incompetence. The stress killed him within a year. So your cousin came here seeking revenge? Justice, he called it. He'd inherited Grandfather's papers, including evidence that several prominent families had helped Hartley escape. He planned to expose them all. Did you help him? Mary hesitated. I restored some of the puppets for his show, but I warned him against his scheme. Blackmail never ends well. The inspector produced the brass key Sarah had been searching for. Do you recognize this? Mary's eyes widened. That's the key to Grandfather's document case. Albert had it last week when he showed me the letters. Where is this case now? I don't know. Albert was very secretive about it. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple noticed something significant, a cut on Mary's left palm, similar to the one Dr. Webb had described on Grimaldi. How did you injure your hand? Puppet strings, Mary replied quickly. Occupational hazard. Outside, Miss Marple shared her observations with the inspector. She's not telling us everything. That wound is too fresh to be from regular work. They returned to the fairground, where a thorough search of Grimaldi's wagon was underway. Hidden beneath a false floor, they discovered the document case Mary had mentioned, but it was empty except for a single photograph, a Victorian family portrait. Miss Marple studied it carefully. Inspector, look at this woman standing behind the family. She's wearing servant's clothing, but her bearing suggests something more. The photograph's labelled on the back, the inspector noted. The Hartley family, 1878, with devoted nurse Catherine Thornfield. Thornfield, Miss Marple exclaimed. Not a distant relative, but a servant in the Hartley household. This changes everything. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Sarah, Mrs. Thornfield's maid, looking terrified. Please, Miss Marple, I need your help. I've done something terrible, but I didn't mean for anyone to die. Sit down, child. Tell me everything. Mrs. Thornfield sent me to retrieve something from the puppet man. Not money, but a photograph. She said it was a matter of family honour. But when I arrived, he was already dead. Those horrible puppets arranged around him. What did you do? I searched for the photograph, but found only empty cases. Then I heard someone coming and ran. What time was this? 6 o'clock exactly. The church bells were ringing. Miss Marple pondered this. If Sarah was telling the truth, it established a precise time for the discovery of the body, but not necessarily the murder itself. Chapter 5. Secrets in the Strings. The next morning's post brought an unexpected development. A package arrived at the police station, addressed to Inspector Clement, containing 3 letters, the missing numbers from Grimaldi's sequence. Posted from London yesterday, the inspector told Miss Marple. No return address, but look at what they contain. The letters revealed the full extent of the conspiracy. James Hartley hadn't acted alone in the murder. He'd had an accomplice who was never suspected. The letters strongly suggested this accomplice was someone within his own household, someone who later married into respectability. Catherine Thornfield, Miss Marple said quietly. She helped Hartley commit the murder, then helped him escape. But why? A commotion outside interrupted them. Colonel Melrose had arrived, demanding to speak with the inspector. I've remembered something important, he declared. That puppet fellow. I saw him before he arrived in Little Wickham. 3 months ago in London at my club. He was having lunch with Timothy Hartley. Timothy was summoned immediately. Faced with this revelation, his composure cracked. "Yes, I knew him before he came here," Timothy admitted. "He contacted me in Italy 6 months ago, said he had information about my ancestor that could clear the Hartley name." "Clear it how?" the inspector pressed. "He claimed James Hartley was manipulated into the murder, that the real killer was someone else entirely. He had letters suggesting Hartley was covering for someone he loved." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with understanding. "Of course, that's why some letters were hidden. They revealed not Hartley's guilt, but his innocence in the actual murder." "But then, who killed the victim in Hartley Square?" the inspector asked. "I believe I know," Miss Marple said, "but we need one more piece of evidence." She requested that Mary Blackwood be brought in for additional questioning. The artist arrived looking haggard, as if she hadn't slept. "Miss Blackwood," Miss Marple began gently, "your cousin wasn't just seeking to expose old conspiracies. He was planning something specific at that final puppet show, wasn't he?" Mary's composure finally broke. He was going to reveal everything, not just the old murder, but a current crime. He'd discovered that someone in the village had been stealing valuable antiques and replacing them with forgeries. Who? He wouldn't tell me, said it was too dangerous, but he'd built a special puppet to represent them. That's the one that was missing. The police constable puppet? No, that was grandfather's. The missing one was new, a female puppet in modern dress. This revelation sent the investigation in a new direction. If Grimaldi had discovered a current crime, it provided a more immediate motive for murder than century-old secrets. Miss Marple suggested they search the mill pond again, this time more thoroughly. As the sun set, constables with nets dragged the murky water until they recovered a sodden mass of wood and fabric. The puppet, when cleaned, was indeed modern in appearance. But what struck everyone was its remarkable resemblance to Mrs. Thornfield herself, not just in features but in dress and bearing. He was going to expose her, the inspector said grimly. But for which crime? The antique forgeries or something related to the old murder? Miss Marple studied the puppet's clothing and noticed something sewn into the hem, a tiny key. "Inspector, this might open something important." They returned to Grimaldi's wagon, where the key fit a previously unnoticed compartment. Inside were photographs documenting replaced antiques in several prominent houses, including the Thornfield Manor, along with receipts from London dealers. She was selling the originals and replacing them with copies, the inspector concluded. Her husband's family treasures sold without his knowledge. But Miss Marple wasn't satisfied. "This explains the forgeries, but not the elaborate staging of the murder. The puppet tableau of the Hartley Square murder, that was personal, symbolic." Late that night, she sat in her parlour, arranging and rearranging the facts like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. The murder scene had been staged by someone with deep knowledge of the original crime, someone who wanted to send a message. Suddenly, she understood. The puppet arrangement wasn't just recreating the old murder, it was revealing its solution. Chapter 6. The Puppeteer's Tale. Dawn brought disturbing news. Mrs. Thornfield had attempted to leave the village during the night, but had been detained at the railway station by alert constables. In her luggage they found several valuable antiques and a substantial sum of money. "She claims she was visiting her sister in Scotland," Inspector Clement told Miss Marple, "but she can't explain the items in her possession." "Bring her to the village hall," Miss Marple suggested. "It's time we assembled all the interested parties." By noon, the main players in the drama had gathered. Mrs. Thornfield, pale but defiant, Colonel Melrose, bristling with indignation, Timothy Hartley, anxious and drawn, Mary Blackwood, silent and watchful, and Dr. Webb serving as medical adviser. Miss Marple stood before them, her gentle demeanour belying the steel beneath. The murder of Professor Grimaldi, or rather Albert Blackwood, is inextricably linked to events that occurred in 1878, she began. To understand why he died, we must first understand what truly happened at Hartley Square. She produced the Victorian photograph found in Grimaldi's wagon. This shows the Hartley household, including Catherine Thornfield, then a nurse. But she wasn't just any nurse, she was James Hartley's lover. The affair had been going on for months before the murder. Mrs. Thornfield's face had gone ashen. The victim in Hartley Square wasn't killed by James Hartley in a jealous rage, Miss Marple continued. He was killed by Catherine Thornfield, who feared he would expose their affair to Mrs. Hartley. James, deeply in love, took the blame and fled to protect Catherine. That's speculation, Mrs. Thornfield protested. No, it's in the letters your ancestor wrote. Letters that Albert Blackwood inherited from his grandfather, the original investigating officer. Inspector Thomas Blackwood had suspected the truth but couldn't prove it. Miss Marple turned to the assembled group. Catherine Thornfield used her blood money well. She married into the respectable Thornfield family, had children, and buried her past, until Albert Blackwood arrived with proof of what she'd done. But Catherine Thornfield has been dead for decades, the inspector pointed out. Yes, but her great-granddaughter is very much alive. And when Albert threatened to expose not just the historical crime, but Mrs. Thornfield's current activities, the antique forgeries, she decided he had to die. All eyes turned to Mrs. Thornfield, who stood rigid with fury. The murder itself was carefully planned, Miss Marple continued. Mrs. Thornfield attended the puppet show, noted when it ended, and waited. She knew Albert often remained behind to pack his puppets. She approached him with the pretense of negotiating payment for his silence. You can't prove any of this, Mrs. Thornfield said coldly. Actually, I can. You see, when you struck Albert with the puppet control bar, you cut your hand on the strings, the same strings that cut his palm when he tried to defend himself. Dr. Webb found matching blood traces on the weapon. Dr. Webb nodded confirmation. The blood types match both victim and another person. We can test Mrs. Thornfield's blood for comparison. But the truly damning evidence, Miss Marple said, is the puppet arrangement. You positioned them to tell the real story of the Hartley Square murder, the woman standing over the fallen man while another figure fled. You were, perhaps unconsciously, confessing to your ancestor's crime. Even if this were true, Mrs. Thornfield said desperately, you have no witnesses. Actually, we do, Miss Marple replied. Sarah saw you leaving the fairground at 5:45, not arriving at 6:15 as you claimed, and Mary Blackwood saw you disposing of the modern puppet in the mill pond. Mary Blackwood nodded slowly. I followed you. I wanted to know who'd killed my cousin. Faced with mounting evidence, Mrs. Thornfield's composure finally cracked. He was going to destroy everything. My family, my position, my life, just like his grandfather tried to destroy my ancestor. So, you killed him, the inspector said quietly. It was self-defense, defense of my family's honor. No, Miss Marple said firmly. It was murder, motivated by greed and pride. You'd been selling your husband's family treasures for years, and Albert Blackwood discovered it. The historical connection just made his threats more personal. As Mrs. Thornfield was led away, Timothy Hartley approached Miss Marple. So my ancestor was innocent of murder, but guilty of protecting a killer. Love makes us do terrible things, Miss Marple replied gently. Your ancestor chose love over justice. Whether that damns or redeems him is for you to decide. Chapter 7. Threads of Truth. The aftermath of Mrs. Thornfield's arrest sent shockwaves through Little Wickham. Her husband, the magistrate, retreated to London, unable to face the scandal. The antique forgery scheme unravelled, revealing thefts from several prominent families spanning nearly 5 years. Miss Marple found herself in the unusual position of comforting Colonel Melrose, who discovered that his prized Victoria Cross was among the replaced items. The real one was sold 3 years ago, he said bitterly. I've been polishing a fake, showing it to my grandchildren with pride. The medal may have been false, Miss Marple said kindly, but the honour it represents remains real. Your grandfather earned that distinction regardless of what metal sits in your display case. Mary Blackwood had remained in the village to settle her cousin's affairs. She invited Miss Marple to examine Albert's puppet collection more closely. He spent years creating these pieces, she explained, showing Miss Marple through the workshop she'd set up. Each one tells a story, usually a tragic one. Did he create them all himself? Most of them. But several were inherited from our grandfather, including the ones used in the tableau. Inspector Blackwood had them made during his investigation to help visualize the crime. Miss Marple examined the Victorian puppets with renewed interest. Your grandfather was ahead of his time using such methods. He was brilliant but obsessed. The Hartley Square case consumed him because he knew the truth, but couldn't prove it. Albert inherited that obsession. And you? Have you inherited it as well? Mary smiled sadly. Perhaps, but I've learned that some truths are better left buried. Although, she hesitated, then retrieved a leather journal from a drawer. Albert kept detailed notes about everyone he investigated. There are secrets here that don't relate to murders, old or new. Miss Marple glanced through the journal, noting entries about various villagers. What will you do with this? Burn it, I think. The village has had enough upheaval. That afternoon, Timothy Hartley called upon Miss Marple, bringing unexpected news. I've been reviewing the Italian lawyer's correspondence with my cousin Albert, he said. It seems there's more to my inheritance than I knew. James Hartley left a sealed letter, only to be opened if certain conditions were met. What? Conditions? If the truth about the Hartley Square murder ever came to light, he produced an age-yellowed envelope. Would you read it with me? I find I need moral support. Together, they read James Hartley's confession, written days before his death in Italy. It confirmed Miss Marple's deductions. Catherine Thornfield had killed his wife's supposed lover in a rage when he threatened exposure. James had helped cover up the crime and fled to protect her. But the letter contained one more revelation. Catherine was pregnant with James's child when the murder occurred. That child, raised as a Thornfield, was Mrs. Thornfield's grandmother. So Mrs. Thornfield is actually a Hartley by blood, Timothy said wonderingly. We're related. How extraordinary, Miss Marple murmured. She killed to protect a family name that wasn't even truly hers. Dr. Webb arrived with final forensic findings. We found additional evidence in Mrs. Thornfield's home, a blood-stained handkerchief hidden in her sewing box, and the missing button from Grimaldi's waistcoat. She kept souvenirs, Miss Marple observed. How strange, considering she was usually so careful. Criminals often do, Dr. Webb replied. some psychological compulsion to retain proof of their deeds. That evening, Miss Marple attended a gathering at the vicarage, where the community was attempting to return to normalcy. The vicar spoke eloquently about forgiveness and redemption, though several pews remained conspicuously empty. Sarah, Mrs. Thornfield's former maid, approached Miss Marple after the service. "I've found new employment in London," she said, "but before I go, I wanted to thank you for believing me." "You were very brave to come forward," Miss Marple replied. "I knew something was wrong when Mrs. Thornfield sent me for that photograph. She was desperate in a way I'd never seen before, almost haunted." Guilt has a way of haunting us, Miss Marple reflected, sometimes for generations. Chapter 8. The Final Performance. 3 days after Mrs. Thornfield's arrest, Inspector Clement invited Miss Marple to review the complete case file before it was sent to the prosecutors. "There's still one thing that puzzles me," he admitted. "The timing. Mrs. Thornfield had been stealing antiques for years without detection. Why did Grimaldi's arrival precipitate murder?" Miss Marple had been pondering the same question. "I believe it was the combination of threats. He could expose both her current crimes and her family's historical shame. But more than that, he was planning a public revelation. The special puppet show he'd threatened. Exactly. He told several people he would reveal everything during a performance on Saturday evening, the day he died. Mrs. Thornfield couldn't risk such a public exposure. Mary Blackwood had discovered her cousin's script for that never-performed show. She shared it with Miss Marple, who read it with fascination. The planned performance would have used puppets to tell 3 interconnected stories: the original Hartley Square murder, the cover-up conspiracy, and a modern tale of theft and deception. The climax would have revealed the identity of the village's antique thief. He was an artist in his way, Mary said. He wanted the revelation to be dramatic, theatrical. Perhaps that was his undoing, if he'd simply gone to the police. He wanted justice, but also revenge, Miss Marple observed. His grandfather's reputation had been destroyed by the case. This was Albert's chance to vindicate him. The Colonel arrived with news from London. The dealers who bought the stolen antiques have been arrested. They're cooperating fully, providing records of all transactions with Mrs. Thornfield. "How much did she steal?" the inspector asked. "Nearly £50,000 worth over 5 years. She was funding a lavish lifestyle her husband's salary couldn't support." Miss Marple noticed something in the transaction records. "Look at the dates. The thefts increased dramatically 6 months ago." "That's when her husband was passed over for promotion to circuit judge," the Colonel explained. "Perhaps that triggered greater desperation." Later, visiting Mary Blackwood's workshop, Miss Marple made an unexpected discovery. Among Albert's puppets was one that hadn't been catalogued, a figure wrapped in black cloth at the bottom of a trunk. Unwrapping it revealed a puppet of extraordinary craftsmanship, depicting a young woman in Victorian dress. The face was hauntingly beautiful, with real human hair and ivory features. "This is much older than the others," Mary said, examining it. "And look, there's something inside the head." Carefully opening a small panel, they found a rolled paper, a love letter from James Hartley to Catherine Thornfield, dated the day before the murder. "My dearest Catherine," it read, "tomorrow we end this charade. I've told Margaret everything. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." "He was going to leave his wife," Miss Marple said softly. "Catherine didn't know this when she committed the murder. She killed to protect a secret that was about to be revealed anyway." "How tragic," Mary murmured. "And how did this puppet come to be here?" "I suspect your grandfather created it during his investigation. hiding the letter inside. Perhaps he thought someday the truth would need to be revealed. That evening, Timothy Hartley hosted a small gathering to thank those who'd helped uncover the truth. Miss Marple, Mary Blackwood, Dr. Webb, and Inspector Clement attended. I've decided to donate my inheritance to establish a museum of local history, Timothy announced, including a section on the Hartley Square case telling the complete truth. That's very generous, Miss Marple said. It's necessary. Secrets festering in darkness poison multiple generations. Perhaps transparency can begin healing. Mary Blackwood had made a decision too. I'm donating Albert's puppet collection to the museum, except for one piece. She produced the Victorian constable puppet. This represents Inspector Blackwood. I'd like to keep it to remember that he was right all along. As the evening concluded, Miss Marple walked home through streets that seemed lighter somehow, as if the village itself had been relieved of a burden. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that one element remained unresolved, the elaborate staging of the murder scene. It had been more than mere symbolism. It had been a message. But for whom? Chapter 9. The Accomplice's Shadow. The trial date for Mrs. Thornfield was set for the following month. As the village prepared for the inevitable publicity, Miss Marple found herself troubled by inconsistencies in the timeline of the murder. Something's not quite right, she told Inspector Clement during tea. Mrs. Thornfield couldn't have arranged those puppets so precisely in the time available. You think she had help? I'm certain of it. The puppet arrangement required knowledge of both the historical crime and puppet manipulation. Mrs. Thornfield had the former, but not the latter. This realization sent the investigation in a new direction. Who in Little Wickham had both theatrical knowledge and access to the crime scene? The answer came from an unexpected source. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Pemberton, approached Miss Marple with a confession. I saw someone at the fairground that evening who hasn't come forward. My husband's secretary, Jonathan Bellwether. Jonathan was a quiet young man of 30 who'd arrived in the village 2 years prior. He managed the church's administrative duties and was known for his efficiency and discretion. What was he doing there? Miss Marple asked. I don't know, but he was carrying something wrapped in cloth, walking away from the puppet theatre around 6:30. When questioned, Jonathan initially denied being near the fairground, but faced with Mrs. Pemberton's testimony, his story changed. I was there, but not for any sinister reason. I've been helping with the fair's organisation. Miss Marple studied him carefully. Mr. Bellwether, what did you do before coming to Little Wickham? I worked in London, administrative positions mostly. And before that? He hesitated. I had a brief career in theatre, stage management. The pieces clicked into place. Jonathan Bellwether had the theatrical knowledge to arrange the puppet tableau. But what was his connection to Mrs. Thornfield? Investigation revealed that Jonathan was Catherine Thornfield's great-great-grandson through an illegitimate line, a family connection hidden for generations. Mrs. Thornfield was my cousin, he finally admitted. She'd been supporting me financially, helping me establish a respectable life here. In exchange for what? Inspector Clement demanded. Nothing at first, but when that puppet man arrived with his threats, she asked for my help. To murder him? No, just to manage the situation afterward. She said there'd been an accident, that Grimaldi had attacked her and she'd defended herself. She needed help making it look different. So you arranged the puppet tableau? Jonathan nodded miserably. She said it would point suspicion toward the historical families away from her. I knew about stagecraft, how to create a scene. I didn't know she'd murdered him deliberately. Miss Marple leaned forward. Why that particular arrangement? The real story of the Hartley Square murder. That was my idea, Jonathan admitted. I'd grown up hearing whispers about our family's dark secret. When I saw Grimaldi dead, those puppets nearby, it seemed like poetic justice, using his own tools to reveal the truth he'd threatened to expose. But you must have realized you were helping cover up a murder, the inspector said sternly. I thought I was protecting family. Mrs. Thornfield had been good to me, the only relative who'd acknowledged my existence. I couldn't bear to see her destroyed. This revelation complicated the legal proceedings. Jonathan was arrested as an accomplice after the fact, though his cooperation and genuine remorse would likely result in a lighter sentence. Mary Blackwood, learning of this development, made an astute observation to Miss Marple. Albert would have found it ironically appropriate, his death scene becoming a confession of sorts, even if not quite as he'd planned. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. In trying to cover up the crime, they ended up revealing deeper truths. The final piece of the puzzle came when police searched Jonathan's rooms, finding a journal he'd kept. I've become part of the very tragedy I'd hoped to escape, he'd written. The sins of our ancestors truly do cascade through generations, drowning the innocent along with the guilty. Chapter 10, Curtains Fall. The trial of Mrs. Thornfield began on a crisp October morning, drawing reporters from London and crowds of curious onlookers. Miss Marple attended each day, her keen eyes observing not just the proceedings, but the reactions of those in the gallery. Mrs. Thornfield, represented by an expensive barrister, maintained her innocence regarding premeditation. She claimed the death was accidental, a struggle that had gone wrong. But the prosecutor, armed with Miss Marple's insights and the physical evidence, painted a different picture of a woman who'd killed to protect her secrets and her stolen wealth. The puppet tableau proved particularly damning. The prosecutor demonstrated how precisely it had been arranged, requiring at least 20 minutes of careful work. This wasn't the panicked reaction of someone who'd killed in self-defense, he argued. This was calculated theatre, designed to misdirect and confuse. Jonathan Bellwether's testimony proved crucial. Though reluctant to condemn his cousin, he was honest about her demeanour that evening. She was calm, controlled, he testified. She knew exactly what she wanted me to do and how to do it. There was no panic, no shock, just determination. Timothy Hartley testified about his ancestors' letters, confirming the historical conspiracy that had provided motive for the murder. His dignified presence and honest acknowledgement of his family's past wrongs earned the jury's respect. Mary Blackwood presented evidence of her cousin's investigation, showing how thoroughly he'd documented Mrs. Thornfield's thefts. He gave her chances to make restitution, she testified. He wasn't initially planning exposure, just wanted the thefts to stop. What changed? The prosecutor asked. She threatened him, said she'd ruin his reputation as his grandfather's had been ruined. That's when he decided on the public revelation. The defense tried to paint Grimaldi as a blackmailer who'd driven Mrs. Thornfield to desperation. But Miss Marple's testimony countered this narrative. Professor Grimaldi, Albert Blackwood, was seeking justice for historical wrongs, she stated clearly. His methods may have been theatrical, but his grievances were legitimate. The jury deliberated for just 3 hours. Their verdict, guilty of murder, with a recommendation for consideration of the emotional circumstances. Mrs. Thornfield received a life sentence. As she was led away, she passed Miss Marple, pausing briefly. "You think you've solved everything," she said quietly, "but you can't solve the damage to innocent lives. My children, my husband." "You're right," Miss Marple replied gently, "but perhaps truth, however painful, allows healing to begin." Jonathan Bellwether received 2 years for his role, though he'd likely serve less. The vicar promised his position would be waiting when he returned. In the weeks following the trial, Little Wickham slowly returned to its routine. The fairground was dismantled, the puppet theatre's location marked only by worn grass. Timothy Hartley's museum project proceeded, with Mary Blackwood agreeing to curate the puppet collection. They planned an opening exhibition titled "Truth in Shadows, The Art of Justice." Colonel Melrose, having recovered his genuine Victoria Cross from the dealers, donated it to the museum. "Let it serve as a reminder," he said, "that honour isn't in the medal but in the deeds that earned it." Miss Marple, resuming her quiet life, reflected on the case one evening with Mrs. Bantry. "It's curious," she said, "how a puppet show intended for children became the stage for such adult drama." "Do you think Grimaldi expected to die for his revelations?" Mrs. Bantry asked. "I think he knew the danger, but believed truth was worth the risk. He was wrong about one thing, though. He thought public exposure would bring justice. Instead, it brought murder. Yet justice was served eventually, thanks to you." "Not just me," Miss Marple corrected. "Justice emerged from the community's willingness to face uncomfortable truths. That's what Grimaldi never understood. Revelation without compassion only breeds more tragedy." On the first anniversary of the murder, a small memorial was held for Albert Blackwood. His puppets performed one final show, not the dark revelation he'd planned, but a gentler story about forgiveness and redemption. Miss Marple watched from her garden as children laughed at the puppet antics, their joy untainted by knowledge of the tragedy that had occurred there. "Every thread has its place in the tapestry," she murmured, returning to her knitting. "Even the dark ones serve their purpose, making the bright ones shine all the clearer." As night fell over Little Wickham, the village settled into peaceful slumber, its secrets finally laid to rest. The end. Thank you for joining me for this tale on Mindful Musings. Sometimes the strings that control us are invisible until someone brave enough, or foolish enough, pulls them into the light. Until next time, dear listeners, this is William wishing you mysteries solved and peaceful dreams.